At 3:17 a.m. on January 12, 1943, in a freezing machine shop behind the crumbling rail yards outside Kharkov, an engineer named Otto Fischer stood over a bin of scrap metal that every other man in his unit considered useless. The room smelled of cold steel, burnt powder, and the faint sweetness of old cosmoline melting near a brazier that barely pushed the air above freezing. Outside, artillery pulse echoed in slow, heavy intervals, shaking dust from the rafters. Otto reached into the bin and pulled out what looked like a twisted receiver from a damaged Sten gun, a barrel segment from a discarded PPSh, and a bent bolt from an MP40 someone had thrown away 3 days earlier. In any other workshop, this would be junk waiting to be melted down. To Otto, it was the beginning of a solution to a problem that had taken too many men from his unit. He had spent weeks repairing weapons that should have saved lives but had instead gotten men killed in the ruins of the city. Every day, squads returned with shattered helmets, blood-darkened greatcoats, and weapons jammed by mud, dust, or simply poor tolerances born from rushed wartime production. Soldiers spoke in low voices about the same frustrations, the same split-second failures that turned corners of buildings into death traps. Otto wasn't a commander or a strategist, he was a machinist drafted into service because production lines had drained the factories of their youngest workers. Before the war, he had calibrated tooling machines in Stuttgart. Now he was expected to keep dozens of submachine guns alive in a world where a single malfunction meant a man never came back. The MP40s had elegant balance but fragile magazines that dented easily and misfed under pressure. The PPSh-41s thrown into German hands after chaotic fighting were brutal but unpredictable, some spitting rounds too fast to control, others jamming under the strain of constant close-quarter bursts. And the Stens that found their way into his unit, captured, traded, scavenged, were as likely to fire flawlessly for days as they were to choke in the first 30 seconds of a building assault. These weapons were supposed to be the lifeline of men forced to fight at 10 meters or less in shattered apartment blocks, yet the reality was far different. No manual, no officer, no factory representative had ever described what a submachine gun needed to survive in a city carved into rubble. The reports were always the same. Weapon dirty. User error. Otto knew they were lies written to cover the gaps between what engineers designed and what soldiers endured. He studied the broken guns that arrived in his workshop like a doctor studying corpses. The patterns were unmistakable, magazines with feed lips bent just enough to cause a hesitation, bolts that rattled inside receivers because factory tolerances widened under stress, recoil springs that lost tension in the first bitter weeks of winter. These were not user errors. They were design compromises made far from the front lines. He remembered vividly the day a young corporal named Weber stumbled into the workshop after barely escaping an ambush in a collapsed stairwell. Weber dropped a frozen MP40 on the table, the magazine still half-loaded, and said he had pulled the trigger only to hear a click that sealed his fate until another soldier dragged him out. Weber's voice shook as he explained that the weapon had jammed 3 times in 2 days. He was 22, pale and exhausted, and Otto realized the man was speaking not to a machinist, but to someone he hoped might save his life. The memory gnawed at Otto for nights afterward. Weber never returned. His replacement said he had died when his weapon misfed during a charge across a courtyard. Otto had repaired that MP40 the morning Weber was killed. The weapon had been within spec. That phrase haunted him in the same way pilots once spoke about delayed controls killing men in the air. He saw the same pattern here, a fraction of a second between life and death, a hesitation born from metal just slightly too loose or springs just slightly too weak. He could feel in his fingertips when a bolt rode too freely, when a barrel shroud flexed more than it should, when a magazine seated with a rattle instead of a confident click. The men didn't hear that difference. Not until it was too late. On the night of January 11th, after another day of malfunctioning weapons and another pair of empty bunks in the barracks, Otto decided he had seen enough. The scrap bin that everyone ignored now seemed full of potential. Each broken piece had at least one part of its structure intact, one segment that, if combined with something else, could eliminate the slack, tighten the tolerances, or create a hybrid more suited to the brutal chaos of close-quarters fighting. He pulled the twisted Sten receiver from the bin and turned it under the lamp. The front half was unusable, but the rear channel was milled thicker than most production examples he had seen. It was from an early batch, when factories still took pride in steel quality. The PPSh barrel fragment still had good rifling at the first quarter, and its thicker profile could reduce heating during long bursts. The MP40 bolt, though bent, still carried a smooth machine face that glided better than the rough-cast Sten bolts that rattled in cold weather. None of these parts matched on paper. But Otto wasn't interested in factory diagrams anymore. He was interested in keeping someone alive. He began measuring each component with a battered caliper. The dimensions were close enough that with some machining he could make them speak the same mechanical language. He set the Sten receiver in a vise, filed down a warped surface, and shaved metal where needed. Every stroke of the file seemed to scrape away another layer of the helplessness that had clung to him for months. He drilled a new alignment hole, reamed the barrel seating, reshaped the bolt guide rails. His breath fogged the air as he worked, but his hands moved with the confidence of a man who knew what steel could become if treated with respect. The workshop was silent except for the rasp of metal and the distant boom of artillery. At one point, a sergeant walked in, glanced at the strange collection of parts, and shook his head as if Otto had finally gone mad. Otto barely noticed. He was focused on building a weapon that could survive where mass-produced firearms failed. By dawn, he had something that resembled a weapon, even if no quartermaster would ever approve it. It had the skeleton of a Sten, the heart of a PPSh barrel, and the precision of an MP40 bolt riding inside. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't official. But when he racked the bolt, the sound was tight, clean, decisive. No rattle, no hesitation, no loose chatter of poorly fitted parts. It was as if the gun had been waiting to be born, and Otto had simply assembled it from scraps the world had ignored. He tested the cycling by hand, loading dummy rounds and watching them feed with a smoothness he rarely saw in standard-issue guns. For the first time in months, he felt something other than dread in his stomach. Maybe this could work. Maybe this strange hybrid could give one man an extra second, one more chance to fire before fate closed in. Otto cleaned his tools, wiped metal filings from his palms, and looked at the assembled weapon resting on the bench. It looked like something that should not exist, something improvised in desperation, yet it held a promise he could not deny. He needed someone to test it, someone who understood what it meant to trust a weapon with their life. And he knew exactly who to ask when the sun finally rose. When the first thin stripe of daylight seeped across the frozen yard outside the workshop, Otto found Sergeant Lucas Bremer leaning against a wall near the supply shed, smoking a cigarette cup between gloved hands. Bremer had the posture of a man who had been hit by every winter the Eastern Front could throw at him, but his eyes were sharp, always searching corners, always expecting the world to collapse in on him. He was 26 but looked closer to 40. He had survived street fighting in Rostov, Kharkov, and the factory districts further east. He had lost 3 weapons to jams in the past 2 months and 2 friends who were standing beside him when their guns failed. If anyone understood why Otto had spent the night working on a Frankenstein weapon, it was Bremer. Otto approached him holding the hybrid SMG wrapped in a piece of canvas. Bremer exhaled a long trail of white vapor and gave a tired half-smile, as if he already knew what Otto was about to say. Otto pulled the canvas back just enough for the sergeant to see the silhouette of the weapon. Bremer raised an eyebrow, then reached out and lifted it carefully, the way a man handles a newborn. He tested the weight, the balance, the angle of the grip, and the softness of the trigger pull. He worked the bolt, listening closely. The sound made him pause. It was full and clean, a confident metal-on-metal click unlike the loose chatter he was used to from the battered Stens and MP40s in the racks. Bremer lowered the weapon, met Otto's eyes, and asked where it came from. Otto explained the modifications as simply as he could without drawing attention to the illegality of the entire project. It wasn't a sanctioned repair, it wasn't a standard model, it wasn't anything the command structure would ever recognize. Bremer listened silently, then nodded once. He didn't care about regulations. He cared about surviving the next firefight in the ruins of the city. He told Otto that his squad was sweeping a block of apartment buildings that afternoon. He would take the weapon with him. If it killed him, he said, he'd make sure to haunt Otto for the rest of the war. Otto managed a thin smile, but Bremer squeezed his shoulder briefly, a silent acknowledgement of the risk both men shared. The squad moved out after midday. Snow fell in light sheets, drifting across the bomb streets where bricks and shattered beams formed jagged mounds. The sound of distant gunfire echoed like metal tapping on hollow pipes. Bremer checked the hybrid SMG once more as they approached the first building. His squad of 8 men advanced cautiously, stepping over frozen bodies half buried in rubble. The air smelled of burnt cloth, charcoal, and the sweet metallic tang that clung to battlefields even in winter. The building ahead was a 5-story structure with its facade half collapsed. Windows gaped like empty sockets, and staircases inside twisted downward into pockets of darkness where enemy soldiers were known to hide. The squad had cleared rooms like this dozens of times, but that familiarity didn't make the process safer. Every door, every stairwell, every broken wall could conceal a lethal ambush. Bremer led the way, the hybrid SMG tucked against his shoulder, its barrel pointed into the void. The first contact came on the second floor. As Bremer crossed the landing, the door to his right burst open. A figure lunged out, firing wildly with a captured PPSh. Bullets sparked off the concrete wall as the squad dove for cover. Bremer snapped the hybrid SMG to his cheek and squeezed the trigger. The weapon barked in a controlled burst, the recoil firm but manageable. The rounds cut through the air in a tight pattern, striking the attacker before he could retreat. Bremer didn't feel the familiar vibration of a chamber struggling to feed. There was no hesitation, no shift in tone, just a smooth rhythm of cycling metal. He moved forward with the others, clearing room after room. Twice more he fired, each time the weapon responded immediately, feeding rounds from the modified magazine Otto had machined with greater precision. After years of dealing with weapons that demanded constant prayer and maintenance to avoid catastrophic jams, this gun felt unmistakably alive. It seemed to encourage aggression, letting him run up staircases and push deeper into the structure without the nagging fear that the first pull of the trigger would betray him. On the 4th floor, they hit resistance. 2 defenders had barricaded themselves in a hallway behind overturned desks and splintered doors. The squad exchanged fire for several minutes. Grenades shook the walls and filled the corridor with choking dust. Bremer crawled forward, using a broken radiator as cover. One of his men attempted to flank the position with a standard MP40, but the weapon jammed as soon as he tried to fire. Bremer heard the man curse, heard the metallic clack of a bolt stuck halfway. The defenders used the moment to lay down suppressive fire, forcing the squad to pull back. Bremer pressed forward alone, rounding the corner and firing a burst. The hybrid SMG performed flawlessly, cutting through dust and debris like a saw. He crouched, reloaded, and fired again, the recoil pushing against his shoulder with predictable force. The defenders tried to retreat but were slowed by the sudden shift in momentum. Bremer's weapon didn't give them the time to recover. The corridor fell silent except for the rasping breath of soldiers shaking off the adrenaline. When the squad regrouped outside the building, Bremer sat on a broken stoop and stared at the weapon resting across his knees. It looked like a machine patched together by desperation, yet it had saved 8 men who otherwise might have been forced into a deadly retreat. Their mission report listed effective submachine gunfire as the reason for the successful clearing operation. Nobody writing the report knew what Bremer carried. but every man in the squad did. That evening, when Bremer returned to the workshop, he found Otto hunched over another pile of parts, oil smudged across his face. Bremer didn't speak at first. He simply placed the weapon on the table. Otto looked at him, waiting for the verdict. Bremer said 3 words, "It never jammed." The words landed like stones. Otto exhaled slowly, feeling a strange weight lift from his chest. Bremer then added something Otto did not expect, "Make 5 more." Otto hesitated. 5 more meant more violations, more risk of command discovering what he was doing, more chances of someone in authority deciding that an unauthorized weapon posed a greater danger than the enemy outside. But Bremer had returned. His squad had survived. And the decision had already been made somewhere deep inside Otto long before the sergeant spoke. He began building again. Word spread quietly among the squad leaders. Bremer had used a weapon that fed smoother, fired cleaner, and held its own in the tightest corners. A corporal from another platoon came to Otto the next morning, asking if he could try one. By the 3rd day, Otto had men offering to trade extra rations, boots, even winter coats for a chance to carry one of his creations. He didn't accept anything. He wasn't doing it for favors. He was doing it because every man who came through the workshop door carried the same haunted expression, an understanding that their lives depended on something as fickle as a spring in a feed lip made in a factory thousands of kilometers away. The official weapons didn't understand desperation. Otto did. He developed variations depending on what parts were available. Some had the shorter PPSh barrels, perfect for pushing around tight stairwells. Others used MP40 trigger assemblies combined with Sten-style receivers that had been reinforced along the feed ramp. A few had custom machine bolts that reduced recoil by spreading the cycling force more evenly. Every weapon was unique, but all shared one trait, the refusal to quit when men needed them most. Within a week, the company commander began noticing oddities in after-action reports. Engagements that normally resulted in several casualties had ended with none. Complaints about jamming had declined. The commander asked the armorer to explain the discrepancy in weapon performance. Otto kept his eyes down, answering only what he had to. He spoke about cleaning routines, adjustments, the cold air affecting factory tolerances. He left out the truth. He left out the scrap metal creations now circulating in small numbers, trusted only by those who had tested them in blood and smoke. One night, an officer from battalion headquarters arrived unexpectedly, asking to inspect the armory. Otto felt a sickening twist in his stomach. If the officer found the modified weapons, the consequences would be immediate, court-martial, imprisonment, possibly worse. But several of the hybrid SMGs were out with squads on night patrols. The racks in the workshop held only standard-issue firearms. Otto answered questions with care, showing logs of repairs and maintenance that omitted every unauthorized modification. The officer eventually left, unconvinced but without evidence. When Bremer returned from patrol the next morning, he discreetly handed Otto one of the hybrids, wrapped in a heavy winter cloth. The weapon smelled of cordite and dust, the marks of another night survived. Bremer said the enemy had begun noticing something different. A prisoner taken during a skirmish had described a short gun with a fast bite, something that sounded like a Sten but fired like a PPSh and never stopped even in freezing mud. He said the enemy was calling it the metal rat, because it darted and bit before anyone heard it coming. Otto listened, feeling the strange sensation that what he had built from broken parts was beginning to gain a life, a reputation. It spread through whispered accounts from men who had faced it in the dark corridors. The hybrid weapon was no longer just a tool, it was becoming something the enemy feared, something unpredictable, something that broke their expectations in the same way the P-38 modification had confounded Japanese pilots months earlier. But this was only the beginning. Other squads wanted them. Other company commanders were filing odd reports. And the enemy, unknowingly, was about to face a weapon that should never have existed. By late January, the hybrid weapons had quietly spread far beyond Bremer's squad. A platoon 2 blocks west had obtained 2 of them and reported firing nearly 300 rounds across multiple engagements without a single stoppage. Another squad, trapped for hours in the ground floor of a bombed-out textile warehouse, fought their way out largely because one of Otto's hybrids kept firing even after being dragged through a slurry of melted snow, powdered plaster, and brick dust. The official logs didn't record the existence of these weapons, but the men who carried them wrote their own history with every building they managed to clear. The enemy noticed as well. Reports intercepted from patrol debriefings mentioned a strange submachine gun, a weapon that resembled a mix of captured models but behaved with a stubborn reliability they hadn't seen before. Some enemy soldiers claimed it had a higher rate of fire, others said it seemed to punch through improvised cover more effectively. They argued among themselves whether it was a new mass-produced model, a prototype, or simply a one-off experiment that had somehow worked too well. Nobody imagined the truth, that the weapon feared in ruined stairwells and narrow alleys had been born in a freezing workshop from a pile of discarded scrap. During one especially brutal engagement near the tractor factory district, Bremer's platoon was ordered to retake a building the enemy had fortified with machine guns positioned in the upper floors. Snow blew through every doorway, filling rooms with a drifting white haze. The advance stalled halfway through the first level. Several soldiers took cover behind a collapsed load-bearing column, pinned down by fire from above. Standard-issue weapons jammed repeatedly, their bolts freezing or their magazines warping after impacts against rubble. One private slammed his MP-40 against the floor in frustration, only to watch the weapon's magazine slide out and skitter away across the tiles. Bremer moved up with 2 of the hybrid SMG carriers and immediately felt the difference. The hybrids didn't hesitate. Their bolts snapped forward with the same clarity as in the workshop. Their burst patterns held tight even as the men fired upward into wooden floorboards and plaster partitions. Bremer advanced up the central staircase, each step echoing with the sharp mechanical pulse of a hybrid weapon. He fired at an enemy soldier leaning over a railing with a Mosin rifle. The man collapsed backward before he could fire another shot. Bremer crouched behind the banister, reloaded with smooth, instinctive precision and pressed forward again. On the 3rd floor, he found a defender desperately trying to clear a jammed PPSh drum. The hybrid SMG barked once, cutting through the man's defenses and sending him sprawling. Bremer moved room to room, clearing corners, each motion reinforced by the weapon's steady rhythm. When his platoon finally secured the building, they counted only 2 minor injuries. The engagement had taken nearly an hour. The hybrid weapons had fired more rounds than most factory-made guns could endure in the conditions. When inspectors later visited the building, they found dozens of empty casings that didn't match any known model in regular service. Soldiers said nothing. Their silence wasn't disobedience, it was protection for the man in the workshop who had given them the chance to live through impossible days. But the secrecy couldn't last forever. Battalion headquarters received increasing reports of inconsistent weapon identification, unusual ammunition usage, and deviations in submachine gun sound signatures. A technical officer was sent to investigate, a man with sharp eyes and a reputation for enforcing regulations with rigid zeal. He arrived unannounced on a morning thick with frost, demanding an immediate audit of all small arms in the company. Otto's heart pounded as the officer examined racks of weapons, checking serial numbers, test-firing a few, inspecting bolts and feed ramps. Otto kept his face calm even as sweat collected under his collar. None of the hybrid SMGs were present, they were out with patrols, but if the officer asked the wrong question or opened the wrong crate, everything would unravel. Bremer remained nearby, silent, his presence a quiet shield. He understood the stakes. Without Otto's weapons, half the men in the company would already be dead. The officer eventually paused at a workbench where Otto had been machining a bolt carrier. He studied it, turning it in his hands. It didn't match standard MP40 or Sten components, and it was definitely not from a PPSh. He asked Otto what model it belonged to. Otto replied that it was a damaged spare he had been reshaping for testing. The officer narrowed his eyes, unconvinced. But before he could push the matter further, a runner burst into the workshop, breathless, announcing that a nearby patrol had come under heavy fire and required reinforcements immediately. The officer abandoned the audit to oversee the response. Bremer grabbed Otto's sleeve on his way out, muttering that this was their chance to remove any compromising parts before the officer returned. Otto nodded and moved quickly, hiding incomplete components under a stack of rusted receivers that would not draw attention. By the time the officer came back, the workshop looked exactly like any other undersupplied field armory, chaotic, cold, and starved of usable materials. In the days that followed, Otto worked with renewed urgency. He produced 12 additional hybrids, each slightly different from the last, each tailored to the parts available. Soldiers from neighboring companies began requesting them. Some even walked for miles across snow-covered streets just to ask if Otto could spare one more. But he refused to let the weapons spread too widely. If too many appeared, higher command would notice. Instead, he focused on the squads most frequently thrown into the worst fighting, those sent into sewers, basements, and collapsed factories. These men needed every possible advantage. Word spread beyond the immediate area. Prisoners of war recounted rumors about a rat gun that could chew through walls and never jam. Some enemy commanders began ordering their men to avoid close-quarters engagements when they heard the distinct cadence of the hybrid firing. That sound, they said, meant trouble. They thought it meant elite units. They thought it meant special forces. They never imagined it meant ordinary soldiers equipped with weapons built in secret by a machinist working alone at night. As February set in, the fighting intensified. Supplies dwindled. Temperatures plunged. But the hybrid SMGs continued to perform. They saved lives not because they were elegant or beautiful or designed by world-famous engineers, but because they refused to fail when men needed them most. Even officers who suspected something was amiss quietly allowed their use. Survival mattered more than bureaucracy. When the company was finally rotated out of the front line after weeks of brutal house-to-house combat, Bremer walked with Otto through the workshop one last time. Broken receivers, twisted barrels, and scorched bolts filled the bins just as before, but scattered among them were the memories of the weapons Otto had built, each one a quiet rebellion against the limitations of factory production. Bremer placed a hand on Otto's shoulder and told him that many of the men owed their lives to him. Otto shook his head, insisting he had only done what needed to be done. He didn't seek recognition, and he never believed he deserved any. But months later, soldiers still returning from the front carried stories of a weapon they had once held, a strange piece of metal that felt heavier, sturdier, more alive than anything they had been issued. They told the stories with a mix of pride and disbelief, as though they had been entrusted with a secret that never made it into official reports or military archives. Years after the war, when historians dug through field notes and witness testimonies, they found scattered references to a mysterious submachine gun assembled from scrap. The accounts matched in subtle ways: impossible reliability under impossible conditions, the way it turned the tide in narrow alleys and stairwells, the way it gave ordinary men the courage to push forward. The historians never found an official designation. No factory claimed ownership. No officer signed off on its design. It remained a ghost in the history of small arms, whispered about by those who had survived long enough to remember it. Otto returned home, opened a small machine shop, and lived a quiet life. He never mentioned what he had built in the winter of 1943. He kept no diagrams, no prototypes. Only one faded photograph remained, tucked into a drawer, showing him in front of the old workshop, a hybrid weapon resting across a table behind him. There was no caption, No date. Just a silent memory. And yet, in the stories told by soldiers decades later, there was always the same message. Sometimes the most feared weapons of a war aren't forged in pristine factories or designed by prestigious engineers. Sometimes they are born in freezing rooms, shaped by hands covered in grease, from metal everyone else threw away. If this story moved you, take a moment to support our work by liking this video. It helps us bring more forgotten wartime innovations back into the light. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new story from the shadows of history. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Our community stretches across continents, and your voice helps keep these stories alive.